Anime is packed to the brim with unique aspects that make each show incredibly interesting. Whether it be something like One Piece known for its story and world building, or an anime like Demon Slayer praised for its animation, the one thing that every good shonen anime has in common is a solid power system. Not every series has a great one, but all the major shonen animes do at least have a foundational system that the rest of the world can be built around. Some shows put more emphasis on the strict rules and details in their systems, while others leave things a bit more open-ended, and for the most part, that's totally fine, since these systems all play a massive role in the story that an anime is trying to tell. However, objectively some of these systems are just better than the others, in my opinion at least. Regardless of how they fit into the world, there's just some systems like Nen from Hunter x Hunter which is incredibly detailed and interesting, but then there's also stuff like Quirks and MHA which don't really have a lot of depth. Now that's not always a bad thing, but personally, I find that animes with more detailed and well thought out power systems tend to be far more interesting across every fight scene, especially because us as viewers can look at the characters using their powers and be able to tell exactly it is what they're doing and how they're doing it. So going off that, I want to rank every major anime power system in shonen to showcase which ones are absolutely peak and which ones are just okay. But to actually have a consistent rating for each anime, I've devised a grading rubric based on 3 distinct categories. Depth, which is how unique and complex each system is without making things too confusing or too simple. Structure, which are the fundamental rules of the system and how characters can consistently work within those rules in a fair way. And aura, which is just how cool each system is. Aura is definitely more of an opinion, but at the end of the day, great power systems obviously should be visually and narratively striking, so I think it makes a lot of sense to include it. Each of those 3 categories will be worth 10 points, adding up to a max total of 30 that each system could potentially get. Also, if this feels familiar, the Weeb Commander did do a top 10 anime power systems a while ago and also used a rating scale of 30, and I played around with the max totals and grading rubric a bit, but 30 total just does fit the best. Now I should preface that I'll try and keep this ranking as objective as possible, but this is still a very subjective discussion, so it's going to include my own opinions too, so don't assume that my rankings are supposed to be word of law. And remember, a system's ranking doesn't accurately reflect an anime's quality. I'm just looking at the system itself. I also planned for this video to cover 20 different systems, but that was just way too long. So if you like this video, then make sure to subscribe so you can get notified when I drop part 2, which will cover the rest of the systems that I don't mention in this video. Also, if you're interested in joining a community to talk about anime, power systems, stories, or just to hang out, then head on over and join the Discord server in the description. New members are always welcome. There's obviously more than just 20 systems out there, but a lot of them are just based on the idea of magic. So if an anime just has magic as its primary system, that's something that I won't include. Like, I love Black Clover, but its system doesn't really make the cut for this video. With that said though, let's dive right into the first system on our list, starting off strong with Fire Force's Pyrokinetics. Fire Force isn't as popular as some of the other animes on this list, and even at first glance, its system looks pretty rudimentary, but it's actually a lot more complex than you might think. Pyrokinesis is the term for the actual power system, while pyrokinetics are the people who can use those powers. Essentially, this system is split up into 4 different categories: the first generation, second generation, third generation, and fourth. Due to the Great Cataclysm 250 years ago that introduced elements of another dimension known as the Adola, people all over the world began to suffer from a condition known as spontaneous human combustion. When someone would spontaneously combust, their body would light on fire and their physical attributes would increase, turning them into a powerful monster fit for rampaging and destruction. These people became known as the Infernals, also known as the first generation pyrokinetics. There's a whole lore reason tied into the Adola for why this happens, but pretty much all you need to understand is that when someone gains pyrokinetic abilities, it's because a connection is formed between them in the real world and their doppelganger in the Adola. Now while this connection most commonly creates infernals, there are rare cases where it gives a person pyrokinetic abilities while still keeping their humanity. This is where we get the other generations, starting with the second generation pyrokinetics who have the ability to manipulate pre-existing flames. They can't make flames of their own, but they do have the ability to alter regular flames or the flames produced by third generations. Third generation pyrokinetics on the other hand can't manipulate flames like the second generations, but they have the unique ability to create flames from their own body or through a catalyst like a sword or a gauntlet, which is known as their ignition ability. Fourth gens on the other hand are extremely rare and tie heavily into the Adola. As with this generation, users gain the ability to use an Adola burst, which can literally alter the laws of physics. However, to use an Adola burst, this person must also have an Adola link, which must be activated by an Adola grace, what can get a bit confusing. To dumb it down though, an Adola link is like having a car, and a grace is like having permission to drive that car, while the burst is like actually pressing on the gas and going max speed. Now just controlling and producing flames doesn't sound too crazy, but what makes the system so much more unique is what they actually define as flames, and how certain individuals can use different different techniques. Karen, for example, is a second generation pyrokinetic. However, instead of just taking fire from his surroundings and throwing it at his enemies, his ability lets him take in enemy flames and attacks as kinetic energy and store it, and then release it at the right time for massive waves of damage. There's also Haumea, who can use her powers to create lightning-like energy, Corona, who can make armaments out of smoke, or even Joker, who uses condensed fire to throw playing cards, and all other kinds of characters with unique abilities that you wouldn't expect from a show purely about fire powers. I'll admit, the way that they explain some of these powers isn't super in-depth, but it's still fun to see the idea of flames being turned into so many unique abilities. Now as for the other second generations, even though manipulating fire sounds weaker than creating it, these users are actually really good at fighting third gens because they can manipulate their flames, or even extinguishing them altogether if they're strong enough. With that said though, third generations are the real bread and butter of this series, as the main character Shinra is primarily a third generation who produces blasts of fire from his feet for insane speed and kicking power. There's also other powerful characters like Ogun and Arthur who can produce weapons and provide even more physical buffs with their flame powers, but these abilities generally vary from person to person without much consistency. Fourth generation are the wildcard powers though, like the ability to cool the entire universe to slow time as seen in show, or Shinra's ability to warp at light speed. Overall though, I think that this system is very unique and interesting, but I definitely wouldn't call it perfect. It's very stylized and a perfect fit for its universe, and the unique ways different pyrokinetics use their powers is always really fun to see. But from a power system standpoint, it leans a little too heavy into the randomness. It's very luck based if you even get a power and what type it would even be. So while the basics of pyrokinetics apply to all users, the structural foundation isn't amazing, but I'd say it's pretty good for what it is. For that reason, I'll give Fire Force a 7 out of 10 in depth, a 7 out of 10 in structure, and an 8 out of 10 in aura, giving pyrokinesis a total 22 out of 30. This system does a really good job of making each character's abilities unique and different from one another, but in terms of consistency and rule following, things can often get a bit fuzzy in this show. And while the Adola and 4th generation users make for some really hype moments and interesting plot, it messes with the general scalability of the system a bit. But damn, I'd be lying if I said these powers didn't look awesome. Next up are the Demon Slayer breathing forms, which are a bit different than pyrokinesis, and while this system has its fair share of problems, it's honestly not that bad. In Demon Slayer, powers aren't really powers at all, at least not in the traditional sense. Demon Slayers use techniques known as breathing forms, which are methods of breathing that give them superhuman abilities that correlate with their swordsmanship. By breathing in a certain way, users can simulate different elements or ideas within their attacks. Within the anime, this is represented through the portrayal of things like water, fire, or thunder flowing off a person's body and sword when attacking. In all actuality though, Slayers aren't actually creating these elements, they're just moving in ways that simulate attacks with similar effects. There's a whole chart of techniques that different Slayers can use, and the cool thing about this system is that people can pick which one is best suited for their fighting style. Something like flame breathing is super intense and causes a lot of physical backlash, so a tough fighter like Rengoku can use it perfectly, while someone like Shinobu, who's a much smaller and fragile woman, wouldn't be able to use it at all. Instead, she uses insect breathing, which is much better suited for her body type and still lets her be incredibly powerful, even with her physical disadvantages. In a breathing form, there are a number of specific techniques that act as different attack patterns, such as a whirlwind of slashes, a giant arc cut, or even a focus-piercing jab. Users can also create their own forms and techniques with enough dedication and practice, like Inosuke, who created his own beast breathing form, or Zenitsu, who added on an additional technique for thunder breathing. While these forms aren't super complex, they shine in their versatility, as people can selectively pick which kind of techniques and forms that they want to use to make their own fighting style, which is something I really appreciate compared to more luck-based systems. I guess I also forgot to mention that there are the effects like the Red Nichiren Blade, Transparent World, and Demon Slayer Mark that all boost a Slayer's stats in some way, but overall those are kind of just tossed in there and don't change much about the system itself. Now with that said, the fact that these effects aren't real kinda sucks. They move like superhuman fighters, but they're really just strong people with swords. The animation and character designs make the fights absolutely incredible, and I'd even go as far as to say that Demon Slayer has the best fight animation in all of shonen, in my opinion. However, since these effects aren't real and we're looking at the system itself and not just the characters, it's really not that cool. For those reasons, I'm gonna give breathing forms a 4 out of 10 in depth, an 8 out of 10 in structure, and a 5 out of 10 in aura. The forms are honestly structured really well due to their simplicity, and it makes it really easy for characters to stay within the rules of the system. But overall, it's just not that complex or cool enough as actual powers, so breathing forms get a 17 out of 30. Moving on, it's time that we talk about one of the more complex systems, and this one's actually featured in the big three, because right now, we're talking about spiritual energy from Bleach. I've watched and read all of Bleach, and honestly before doing more research, I kinda thought that Reiatsu was just the catch-all for everything, but that's not exactly the case. After a bit of refreshing my memory, it turns out that there's actually 3 main power sources that everyone uses in Bleach. There's Ryoku, which is the sum of the potential energy in one's body, Reiatsu, which is the strength and pressure of one's Ryoku, and Reishi, which are the energy atoms that make up the environment. They don't really talk a lot about Ryoku in the show, and they mostly just say Reiatsu, so while they're different, a good way to think about it is that Ryoku is like the glass that determines how much water a person can have in it, while Reiatsu is the amount of water that actually goes into a glass and how concentrated that water is. So from here on out, I'm just gonna refer to power as Reiatsu. Reishi, on the other hand, is what makes up the environment of Soul Society, Hueco Mundo, and the world of the living, although it's far less concentrated there. Reishi isn't really that important for most characters, since the majority aren't actually human and can expel Reiatsu from their body. But Quincy's, however, are human and can't do that, so they have to take Reishi from the environment and mix it with the raw power in their own body to form things like weapons and other Quincy powers. Honestly, I think making 3 separate categories for the term power itself is a bit much, but other than that, the system is actually pretty smooth sailing. It's complex for sure, but it makes sense. There's 4 main different types of fighters in Bleach. Soul Reapers or Shinigami, who originate from Soul Society, Arrancars, who are from Hueco Mundo, Fullbringers from the world of the living, and Quincy's from the world of the living as well. Soul Reapers and Arrancars pretty much use their powers in the same way, there's just different flares for each class. A Soul Reaper's main power comes mostly from their Zanpakuto, which is a sword with insane abilities. There's the normal state, which is just a regular sword, then there's the Shikai, which changes the sword's shape and gives it a unique ability, and finally the Bankai, which fully releases the sword's natural state and often alters the user as well. It's also the peak of Soul Reaper powers, so Bankais are usually insanely strong. There's also other things Soul Reapers can do with their power, like Kido, which is pretty much just magical spells, Hakudo, which is enhanced hand-to-hand combat, as well as Flash Step and Ho-Ho, which increases movement and agility. I'm not going to do a very deep dive into Kido, but just know that those spells have all kinds of unique and complex uses that can be intertwined with other Soul Reaper powers as well. Arrancars are very similar, but instead of Japanese names, everything is in Spanish. They also have swords with a Bankai style release called a Resurrección, and a few different Kido style spells like Sero and Bala, which are large blasts of energy, plus things like Hyoro, which is hardened skin, and Sonito, which is their form of Flash Step. Fullbringers, on the other hand, are a bit different because they funnel their energy into certain objects and transform them, creating unique abilities that are far more of a wildcard type situation than the rest. However, they aren't as important in the series. Then finally, there's the Quincy's, who are the most different, as they use Reishi instead of Reiatsu based power. However, once again, it's still very similar to the other powers, but now just with a German flair. Quincy's create spirit weapons that are usually bows and arrows. However, in the 1000-Year Blood War, many of the powerful Quincy's had different abilities. They also have a Bankai style release called Volstandig, a flash step move called Harenkakyu, and a multitude of other Kido-like spells as well. As you can see, there's a ton of different abilities each class can use, and it also has the perk of letting users choose what they want to specialize in. You might not get to pick your Zanpakuto's power, but the options for how you want to get stronger are actually very broad. You could be like Yoruichi and ditch the sword entirely and just fight with lightning quick speed and power, or be like Urahara and become insanely powerful in every category. The possible abilities that this system lays out are so vast, which makes every fight so unique and fun to watch. It might be a bit more complex than it needs to be when it comes to the classifications of these powers, but in general the complexity of this system is what makes it so cool. For those reasons, I'm going to give Bleach's system an 8 out of 10 in depth, an 8 out of 10 in structure, and a 10 out of 10 in aura, giving Bleach a total 26 out of 30. It could probably be a bit easier to understand, but once you understand the basics of this system, it just has so much to offer and it makes the fights absolutely incredible. Next up is a system from one of my favorite animes of all time, Attack on Titan with their Titan-based power system. Now I just want to say that regardless of the system, AOT is absolutely peak and you should totally watch it if you haven't, but looking at the power system as its own thing, that's a bit of a different story. Titans are the main form of powers in AOT, but there's only a select few characters with actual Titan shifting abilities. In total, there are 9 Titans with unique abilities, but since Titan powers can be transferred from person to person, there's more than just 9 characters in the series who are actually Titan shifters. One of the classics is obviously Eren Yeager's Attack Titan, which specializes in hand-to-hand duels, but the Attack Titan also scaled the hardest off of willpower, which made Eren a perfect fit. It also had the ability to view time all at once instead of just past, future, and present, but that's more of a lore thing than a combat power. There's also Reiner's Armored Titan, Bertolt's Colossal Titan, Porco's Jaw Titan, etc, etc. Unfortunately though, those who harness the power of the Titans also gain the Curse of Ymir, a condition that limits their lifespan to only 13 more years after becoming a Titan. By inflicting a wound upon oneself, Titan shifters begin to form flesh and bone around their human bodies that pretty much act as their organic mech suit that they can fight in. Shifting doesn't actually change a user's body, it just creates more matter around them. Each Titan's power varies significantly, but all of them gain a massive boost in size, strength, speed, agility, and defense, although some are much better at certain categories than others, like how Reiner's Armored Titan is built for defense while Peak's Cart Titan is built for endurance. ODM gear is another major part of the series that regular humans use, but since it's technology, I wouldn't really count it as a power system. However, it's still really cool. There is one major weakness that all of these Titans have though, and it has to do with their neck. Except for the Warhammer Titan, who creates a crystallized shell and hides away in a safe location, every Titan shifter's main body resides in the nape of their neck, making that a prime spot for enemy attacks. I could keep going on and on about each Titan's details, but that's the basics of the system, and each Titan's additional abilities are less of a power system thing and more of a lore thing. Like at the very end of the series, Falco became a Jaw Beast Titan hybrid due to specific lore reasons, so things like that aren't very easy to quantify system-wise. Overall, AOT does have a lot more depth as a series than any other anime or show that I've ever watched, but if we're just looking at the power system in a vacuum, Titans are pretty simplistic. They're just 9 different organic mech suits that specialize in different things. For those reasons, I'm gonna have to give Titans a 5 out of 10 in depth, a 6 out of 10 in structure, and an 8 out of 10 in aura, giving AOT a total 19 out of 30. Aura is definitely coming in clutch for the Titans though, because no matter what the specific details are, the Titan battles in the show are just so fire. Moving on to number 5, we have one of the most talked about power systems as of right now, and of course, I'm talking about Cursed Energy. Jujutsu Kaisen is famous for a variety of factors, but undoubtedly one of the reasons that it's so popular is its well thought out power system. While Cursed Energy has its fair share of flaws, overall it does most things pretty well. Compared to something like Bleach's power system, which is very complex but sometimes a little tricky to understand, Cursed Energy does a really good job of having a nice in-depth system that is relayed to the viewer in a way that doesn't really trip people up. Cursed Energy is born from the accumulation of negative emotions created by everyday people. Every person in Japan has at least some level of Cursed Energy, and that Cursed Energy often leaks out of people to form cursed spirits. However, if someone is trained in the art of controlling their emotions, they can harness that Cursed Energy and use it for personalized abilities. When someone's emotions spike, the flow of their Cursed Energy will fluctuate too, so Jujutsu sorcerers must undergo heavy training to alter the natural flow of their Cursed Energy to be consistent. This lets users evenly coat their body in Cursed Energy for increased physical attributes, or sorcerers can move that energy around to specific body parts for specialized enhancement. The greater one's mastery over the flow of Cursed Energy in their body, the more that they can do to utilize that power. So even those with less Cursed Energy can still defeat those with more depending on how skilled each person is at controlling their flow. Now while Cursed Energy might be the base of the system, it's cursed techniques that are what really make this series so special. In rare cases, certain people may be born with an innate technique, which is a form of sorcery either completely unique to them or a technique that runs through one's bloodline. Things like Megumi's 10 Shadows and Gojo's Limitless are both inherited techniques, while Toto's Boogie Woogie and Nobura's Straw Doll technique are unique to them. There's also the use of contracts and binding vows, which lets users manipulate their techniques by implementing certain trade-offs, which is a really unique aspect, although I wish that was actually utilized a bit more in the series. While techniques aren't the most interesting since once again it's pretty luck-based, what I really love about this system is how it makes users get so creative with their abilities. Megumi can combine different Shikigami to suit whatever fighting style he may need, Choso can use blood manipulation in a different way in any fight if he wanted to, and my all-time favorite Toto has a technique that doesn't actually do any real damage, but through incredible battle IQ, his Boogie Woogie becomes insanely strong. For those reasons, I'm gonna have to give Cursed Energy an 8 out of 10 in depth, a 7 out of 10 in structure, and a 7 out of 10 in aura. The complexity of this system itself really isn't that crazy, but each character's individual techniques are all quite well thought out and detailed. And while JJK is very strict about following its rules, over the time the series kinda began to stray away from its original structure, which isn't a huge deal in shows with less detail-oriented power systems, but for JJK specifically, there's times when things just don't make a whole lot of sense. But that's mostly manga stuff, and this is pretty much an anime-only list, so I don't want to dock it too many points for that. So overall, Cursed Energy gets a solid 22 out of 30. Hey, I'm gonna jump back in here real quick because I don't know how, but somehow I completely forgot to mention domain expansions, which are such an important part of JJK as they're pretty much the peak of sorcery. Sorcerers and curse users can expel their Cursed Energy out of their body to create an area essentially of their dominion, and when they trap another person inside their domain, they can either create a new technique or an amplified technique that they already have to use on their opponent that will always hit. There's also the simple domains and new shadow style which can help combat this, as it makes a little mini domain that can counteract these sure hit effects and can be used by anyone regardless of their technique, which I don't know how I forgot about that either. And there's some really cool domains in the series, so I'm gonna have to bump the aura up by 1 point to give JJK a total of 23 out of 30. Next up is Magi's Djinn-based power system, which isn't nearly as popular as something like Cursed Energy, but it has an incredibly stylized system that I think really makes this series shine. It's been a minute since I've actually watched Magi, but I definitely remember it for being a show with some really unique flair and abilities. Turns out, there's actually quite a few similarities with the magic in this world and Reiatsu and Bleach. Basically, Rook is the foundational energy that makes up the world, and by giving commands to that Rook, pretty much anything is possible. To actually use the power of the Rook though, one must draw out the system's energy known as Magoi, which is the fundamental energy that makes all magic abilities possible. Then there's the magic itself, which manifests in different types of elemental forms. Even though there's 3 names, all you really have to understand is that the majority of all people only have a certain amount of Magoi in their body, which in turn dictates how much magical power they can use. But there's also the extremely rare characters known as Magis like Aladdin and Judar, which have the ability to use all the Rook around them as an almost endless energy source. There's also 2 different types of Rook, being the light and the dark Rook, which has its lore reasons, but it's pretty much just good guy powers versus bad guy powers. Now while there are certain people called magicians who can produce different types of common magic, if that's all this system had, I wouldn't even include it, as there's probably over 100 other animes with an identical system. What I think actually makes this series shine though and is far more interesting and relevant are the Djinns. Djinns are these massive blue godlike figures that each have control over a certain element or aspect of reality, and they reside within these large structures scattered across the world known as dungeons. When a person traverses through a dungeon by battling monsters and avoiding traps, they'll reach a final room where they get to meet the Djinn, where they are then rewarded with riches as well as becoming the master of that said Djinn. This Djinn will then apply a seal on onto something that a user is carrying that they are familiar with, most often being a weapon and becoming what's known as a metal vessel. These vessels are actually really similar to Zanpakutos in Bleach, as they have their regular form where they can just use some power based off the Djinn, then the partial Djinn equipped which transforms the weapon itself, then finally a full Djinn equipped which alters the user as well, much like a Shikai and Bankai. A Djinn equipped isn't the pinnacle of these powers though, as users can also create what's called extreme magic, which are the massive symbols in the air created through one's vessel, before expelling a massive spell or attack from that symbol. Personally, I'm a massive fan of power systems that alter one's appearance and have a really nice style, so Magi definitely gets some points in my book for that. One person can also be the master of multiple Djinns as well. For example, Sinbad, who has a whopping 7 different Djinns contained on the metal vessels on his person, and one even has the ability to divide that Djinn's power into smaller fragments known as household vessels, which can be used by good friends of the master. So while this series has your plain old magic which is just kind of whatever, each Djinn's unique abilities really make these powers far more interesting. For these reasons, I'm gonna give Magi's system a 6 out of 10 in depth, a 6 out of 10 in structure, and an 8 out of 10 in aura. The complexity of this system isn't too crazy, especially compared to many of the other systems on this list, but it is very stylistic and unique, so those balance out to give it a decent depth score. As for structure, it has a solid outline that's not bad by any means, but it's kind of floaty and lacks significant rules, because people can kind of just do really strong stuff if the story demands it. From what I've seen that is, which is the anime from like 6 years ago, so I could always be a bit wrong. But man, the style and flair of each Djinn equipped and the Djinns themselves are something that I really just think is super awesome. So in total, Magi's system gets a 20 out of 30. It is one of my favorites, but objectively speaking, there are definitely better ones on this list. Moving on from Djinns, we now have a system that might be the most controversial on this list, as it has a lot of discourse revolving around whether it's actually good or not, and that's Quirks from MHA. Quirks are kinda like if you take the randomness from innate techniques in JJK and then dial that meter up to 10. They're literally just completely random, with 80% of the population having at least some kind of quirk and the other 20% just kinda get screwed. There's not a lot of explaining that I can really talk about for these quirks. It's pretty much either you get a power or you don't, and these powers themselves are super random. You might gain an insane power like Bakugo's explosion, or something practically useless like this guy's long nose. However, with that said, each individual quirk honestly has a lot of room for growth, and I feel like most people tend to overlook that. Even at the very start of the series, All Might mention that many people actually misunderstand their quirks on a fundamental level, which leads them to not unlocking their full potential, which is a concept that's actually explored beautifully in MHA Vigilantes. While the base system of quirks is nothing special, the individual training and awakening of different individual quirks is something that MHA actually does really well. MHA Vigilantes is literally a story all about that concept, as the main character Koichi turns a seemingly weak quirk into a top 10 pro hero level ability through understanding and training. And as for the main series, Bakugo goes from just creating explosions on his hands to storing up that power and releasing it in large bursts, then learning to fly from consistent blasts, and eventually making explosions anywhere on his body. And many of those level ups aren't just random power or friendship boosts. These advancements come from deliberate training and understanding of one's own quirk. Although I would be lying if I said that there wasn't at least a little bit of power or friendship magic going on to help out, but that's the majority of shonen. Another really great example of understanding a quirk's limitations and capabilities would have to come from my favorite character in MHA, Lemillion. Mirio's quirk permeation lets him turn untouchable and pass through objects, but it's in no way an easy to use quirk because every part of his body must be impermeable or physical at the right time, otherwise he might slip through the ground or slam his face into a wall. Through consistent training and understanding of his quirk though, he turned something that was seemingly weak into an incredibly powerful tool that led to his rise as a hero. So while quirks look incredibly simple on the surface, they actually have a lot more depth than you might think. For that reason, I'm gonna give quirks a 6 out of 10 for depth, a 5 out of 10 for structure, and a 6 out of 10 for aura. It's not the most complex system or anything, but each character's individual powers are a little deeper than you'd expect. But the consistency of these quirks can easily get thrown out of whack due to the sheer amount of characters in the series. Same with aura. Obviously the massive characters have incredibly hype moments, but there's also just so many heroes with really boring powers and lackluster feats. So in total, quirks get a 17 out of 30. Next up is a much newer power system that I've actually been covering a lot on this channel, and that's the Vital Instruments from Gachiakuta. If you don't know anything about Gachiakuta, I'd highly suggest you read it because the manga is absolutely peak. The anime is pretty good too, but the manga art is just really hard to beat. Anyways, if you don't know though, Gachiakuta's power system runs off these things called Vital Instruments, or Djinns in Japanese. These Djinns can be any item as long as someone cares for it deeply over a long period of time. Zanka is a supporting character, and also a great example of how a Vital Instrument is created. When he was younger, he began training with a simple stick because he wanted to prove that the average man can become great even without talent. Over the years, he trained and took really good care of his stick until he became what's known as a giver, a person who has the power to transform their object into a vital instrument. This is done through thought energy, which is the main power source in the series, although little is still known about its true origins. After a person has cared for their item long enough, they're able to funnel their thought energy into that object and transform it into something much stronger. This is often a weapon, like Zanka's stick turns into a bladed staff, or Engine's umbrella that turns into a spear and shield combo weapon. However, that's not always the case. Someone like Semi Greer, who isn't much of a frontline fighter, has a Jinki where her glasses expand and she can see a person's soul and witness their true nature. Or Isha, who can use her cord to guide electricity through someone's body and heal them. The really great thing about this system though is that it's not random. Whatever a giver wants their vital instrument to do, it becomes an object that can carry out that goal. I don't mean that they can change their ability on the fly, but if someone had a pair of shoes that they've kept since childhood, and they want the ability to be unrestricted by barriers and travel the world, those shoes could become a Jinki that lets someone teleport around, while the same shoes worn by someone with more malicious intent could become bladed ice skate style weapons meant for making large cuts. This isn't a perfect system for anyone that wants to be a giver though, as some people just can't seem to turn into one even if they try. There's a few somewhat recent developments in the manga that imply that there needs to be a catalyst for someone to activate their giver powers, and that seems to vary from person to person, but we still need more information on that before we can conclude anything. Some vital instruments can even be passed down through generations, increasing their power over time, and that's not even mentioning the Watchmen series, which are the most powerful vital instruments in the anime. But pretty much all you need to know about this series is that they each have very unique abilities different than most Jinkis, and they're incredibly powerful. Overall though, I really like this system and I think it's a really nice breath of fresh air compared to a lot of other shows. And for the reasons I stated, I think that I'll give vital instruments a 7 out of 10 for depth, an 8 out of 10 for structure, and a 7 out of 10 for aura. The depth isn't too crazy as it's mostly just enhancing an object and gaining a special ability, but the way characters use their abilities and the true nature behind their powers are more complex. And the rules for this system and the overall framework I think is really well done. So this system gets a 22 out of 30 overall. Next up, we're going to move on to a system that has been around for many different generations, and that's Dragon Ball's Ki. Now I'll be honest, I wasn't much of a Dragon Ball fan when I was younger, or even much of one now, so I didn't know too much about Ki before making this video. However, after researching a bit and looking it up, it overall seems pretty simple. Ki is pretty much just life force, and it's what lets powerful characters in the Dragon Ball universe perform the insane feats that they do. It's made up of 3 main categories: Genki, which is vigor, Yuki, which is courage, and Shoki, which is right-mindedness. Or in other words, physical strength, emotional strength, and focus strength. Ki also has a few different forms, such as the regular Ki, evil Ki, and godly Ki, which are kind of exactly what they sound like. Evil Ki is used by villains with evil intent, godly Ki is a much more refined and powerful type of energy used by the higher level characters, and regular Ki is just regular. Certain races in Dragon Ball each have a rough level of Ki that they're born with, however through intense training in the 3 categories, people can significantly increase the amount of Ki in their bodies. A person's max level of Ki isn't just how much they can use though, as to be able to efficiently pull out that Ki and turn it into power, a user often has to undergo deep training and have either increased levels of focus or a spiked emotional state that causes their power to drastically increase. This is essentially what Super Saiyan does, as it raises the total amount of Ki in one's body, but it also unlocks the ability to use more of that Ki instead of keeping it trapped away. As for what Ki can actually do, it's structured to pretty much be an all-encompassing tool for a variety of uses. Boosting physical stats like strength, speed, durability, and senses are all very common uses. However, there's also the condensing of Ki for energy blasts like to shoot lasers or launch longer range attacks. Turns out there's also a separate system known as magic that's not really related to Ki, but it seems to be far less in depth and it's just there to make more abilities possible. There's many different techniques that specific characters in Dragon Ball can do with their Ki, but overall to dumb it down, it's pretty much just an energy force that can be increased by training one's body and mind. It's not the most complex by any means, but in terms of the show itself, it doesn't really need to be. After all, Dragon Ball wouldn't be so popular if people didn't like it. For those reasons, I'm going to give Ki a 3 out of 10 in depth, a 6 out of 10 in structure, and an 8 out of 10 in aura. There really just isn't a lot going on for me to give it a higher score in depth, and its structure is solid, but still wishy-washy at times from what I've read. But this series really is just known for its hype moments in aura, so that's where I'm going to give it most of its points, rounding out Ki to a 17 out of 30 overall. We've covered some pretty cool systems so far, but this next one's gonna be a bit of a switch up, because right now we're talking about the hunter ranks from solo leveling. Based on my rules from the start, it honestly doesn't make much sense to include this system on the list as it's pretty much just magical power. But the main character is unique in that he has his own power system, and I kinda just want to mention what the opposite of some of the great systems on this list would be. Now I read the entire manhwa a while ago, and I'll say that the art was fire, the fights were great, and many of the characters had really cool designs. But that's about it. In the solo leveling universe, only 0.1% of the population is even born with mana that gives them the unique ability to use magical powers, and the amount of mana that they're born with determines what their hunter rank is. The lowest rank is E, and it goes all the way up to S, with each character becoming exponentially more rare the more that you go up the ladder. There is one level above S rank though, known as the national rank. However, there are only 4 people on the planet that were national rank before Sung Jin Woo power fantasied his way up to the top. There are different kind of hunters though, such as the fighters, mages, assassins, tankers, healers, and rangers. And if you've ever watched any anime or played literally any video game ever, these are pretty self-explanatory. Higher level hunters often get more unique style abilities than the lower ranks though. Like 2 D rank mages will most likely have very similar attacks, while 2 S rank mages can have completely different skill sets and attack patterns. It all just falls under the category of spellcasting. And that's pretty much it. Once you have your rank, there's no changing it. There are very rare instances of hunters increasing their power, but for the vast majority of people, all the training in the world won't move your power an inch. That's why it's so unique for the main character Sung Jin-woo to be able to rise through the ranks, as he's given a completely different power system based on video game logic. His system makes him train to complete tasks to unlock rewards like increased physical stats, the ability to summon armies of soldiers from defeated enemies, telepathy, powerful weapons, potions, items, you get the gist. So does it look cool? Absolutely. But is it unique? No. Pretty much every other hunter is stuck with whatever power they naturally have, while Jinwoo has the ability to continue to get stronger and stronger until he absolutely smurfs on everyone else towards the end. My biggest issue with this power system though in the series as a whole isn't that it's just stagnant powers, but it's how all the other interesting characters get completely scrapped as the series goes on. All of these S-rank hunters have insanely cool designs and powerful abilities that I always love seeing in action, but as Sung Jin-woo got more powerful than all of them, it made all of these interesting characters pretty much obsolete. I get that the whole point of the stagnant powers is to make Jinwoo's character special, but it really just makes so many other aspects of this system and series as a whole for that matter really weak. For those reasons, I'm gonna give hunter ranks a 2 out of 10 in depth, a 4 out of 10 for structure, and an 8 out of 10 for aura. The aura and fight scenes are obviously the main focus of the show, so it's gonna be decently high, but the structure isn't great and the depth is honestly super shallow, leaving solo leveling overall with our lowest rank of 14 out of 30. We're now down to our final entry on this list, and for this spot, I'm gonna go with stands from JoJo's, another really cool power system that are infamous for their unique abilities. I'll do my best to explain the basic rules of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure system, but just know that the overarching rules for stands are very wishy-washy and don't have a lot of hard limits, except for the fact that no stand can bring someone back to life. Stands are essentially the physical manifestation of a user's inner psyche, so the abilities and appearance of each stand vary heavily from person to person. To gain a stand, one can either be pierced with the stand arrow, they can be born with one, or they can acquire one later in life, but the details for how this happens are pretty vague. The majority of stands are humanoid figures that appear next to a person. Smaller creatures or objects that can go longer distances, and in rare cases, something completely different. But because of JoJo's bizarre nature, these stand abilities can vary significantly, so it's not very easy to explain all 180 something stands in a very concise manner. The majority of stands are all incorporeal unless attacked by another stand, although this rule does have its outliers. As long as a stand is fully connected to the user and not sentient or separated though, any damage given to a stand is reflected on the user's body, and vice versa. There are close range stands like Jotaro's Star Platinum, which excels in raw physical power and grit. Then there's the more range stand abilities like Okuyasu's The Hand, which can literally remove matters of space entirely. The thing is, there's not a lot of hard rules that cover every stand, but each person's individual ability is shrouded in possibilities and limitations. And so much of the fun in JoJo's is watching what kind of insanity people can pull off by figuring out creative applications within the rules of their stand. Like I mentioned earlier though, there are major exceptions to a ton of these rules. For example, there are stands who have their own sentience and can act independently of the user, or stands that don't seem to fit into the category of stands at all, as they don't seem to have real bodies. Not all stands are created equal, as some people just don't even have the ability to capitalize on their stand, even if it fits their personality, while some people are just blessed with really strong powers and capable bodies. So while I can't go much more into depth about stands overall, each individual stand has the power for an entire paragraph of its own, and for that reason, I'm gonna give stands a 9 out of 10 in depth, a 4 out of 10 in structure, and a 10 out of 10 in aura. The basic structure is really all over the place as stands really vary heavily from person to person, and as for aura, it's obviously going to be a 10 out of 10 because that's kind of JoJo's whole thing. So overall, stands get a 23 out of 30. And that's every system I've got for y'all today. I know some of you guys are going to come at me in the comments for not including your favorite anime system, but just wait until part 2 drops, and if I still didn't include an important one then, y'all can light me up in the comments, but I'm trying to make sure I cover all my bases. So make sure to hit that subscribe button to be notified when I release part 2. There's going to be some classic hitters on there that I'm sure y'all can guess, and some that you might not expect, so you'll just have to wait and see. Also, as you could probably tell, I haven't seen every anime on this list. I've seen most of them, or at least bits and pieces, but some of these systems took a lot more research for me to understand. So if I missed some stuff or misinterpreted your favorite systems, I promise I wasn't intentionally hating. And just remember, I tried to keep this list as objective as possible, but these are still my opinions after all, so take them with a grain of salt. Oh, and also, go ahead on over to the description and join the Discord. We could really use some more members in there, and if you want to be part of this community, then you're welcome to stop on by. With that said though, that's about all I've got for you guys today, so I hope y'all have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace!